Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into this week's edition of my top starts and sits for week 7 of this NFL season. As always, guys, you know what you're going to get in this video. My top 2 starts and sits for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position. I'm not going to waste any more time, so you can move on with your day or night, depending on when you're watching this. So let's just go ahead and dive into tonight's video. My top starts and sits for quarterback, obviously starting with the starts. Jordan Love against the Denver Broncos. This season, it's been like, hey, are these players going against the Broncos? And let's play them. So if you're looking for a streaming quarterback, especially with 6 teams being on a bye week, Trevor Lawrence is questionable tomorrow. I think I would turn to Jordan Love. He's going against the Broncos defense, who have allowed the second most points per game to the quarterbacks this year. They're giving up 20.8 points a game. And then when you look at the last 4 games the Broncos have played, they've allowed at least 3 different quarterbacks to throw for over 300 yards. And then they have allowed 10 touchdowns to the quarterback position and have only managed 3 interceptions over the last 4 games. So teams are moving the ball through the air and spoiler alert, through the ground on this team. And I totally expect Jordan Love to get things back on track after that last game that he had heading into their bye week. And that's another thing too, they're coming off their bye week, they're going to be healthier, so that I expect this Packers offense to look a lot better than what it did that last Monday night game we saw them. My other top start, I'm going to go with Geno Smith against the Cardinals. The Cardinals are allowing 19.7 points per game to quarterbacks this year. That is the 5th most allowed this season. As far as the last 4 games, 3 quarterbacks have at least thrown for over 245 yards against their defense. And there's only been 6 passing touchdowns and 2 interceptions allowed in their last 4 games for that Cardinals defense. But I do expect that kind of like the Packers, right? The Seahawks offense kind of disappointed this past Sunday against that Bengals defense. I expect they're going to get things back on track, and I expect Geno Smith to bounce back from his game that he had this past Sunday, which is why I think he would make a great streaming option if he's out there on your waiver wire still. I know I picked him up in a couple leagues that I have Trevor Lawrence in, so I'm going to be playing Smith over him. So yeah, if Geno Smith's out there on the market, I would definitely pick him up this week. My top sits. I'm gonna go with my top one. I'm gonna go with Jared Goff against the Ravens. This Ravens defense has been really good through the first 6 weeks of the year. As far as what they are doing in fantasy, they're only giving up 9.6 points a game to quarterbacks this year. That is the 2nd fewest across the league. And then when you look at the last 4 games, the most yards that a quarterback has thrown against this defense was 227 yards. And they've only given up 2 passing touchdowns over the last 4 games, and they've picked off the quarterbacks 4 times. So they've gotten more interceptions than touchdowns allowed. A quarterback hasn't even reached the 250 mark against this defense in the last 4 games. So if we're going to consider Goff. I know he's kind of been a strong performer this year, but with how stingy the Ravens defense has been, I would definitely look for more of a ceiling game out of a streaming option than Goff. Another guy that you might be thinking about playing because it's 6 teams on a bye week, quarterbacks are hurt. Maybe you're going to try to shoot for a Kirk Cousins ceiling game. This is a game I would look to avoid Cousins. This is definitely a game I would see him finishing closer to his floor, especially considering he was definitely a letdown against that Bears defense this past weekend. But when you look at this matchup with the San Francisco 49ers, as far as fantasy, they're only giving up 9.9 points a game this season to quarterbacks. That's the 3rd fewest allowed in the NFL. And then when we look at the last 4 games of production, they've only let one quarterback throw over 200 yards against their defense, and they've only allowed 3 touchdowns to quarterbacks in the last 4 games and have 6 interceptions. So they have also doubled in interceptions compared to passing touchdowns allowed. And I think with that 49ers team as a whole, losing to a Browns team that had a backup quarterback that wasn't even on their roster to start the season, or at least in training camp. I can't remember if PJ Walker signed with their practice squad prior to the season or not, but he was originally with the Bears. But anyways, now I'm getting off track. My whole point that I was trying to get to is that I totally expect this 49ers defense to be totally fired up after losing this past weekend, and their defense is going to be playing with a fire lit underneath their ass, to say the least. And I expect we're going to see more of a floor game out of Cousins than a game closer to his ceiling. Moving into the running backs position, I already kind of spoiled this one, but sticking with that, again, if you got a chance to play any of your guys against the Broncos, you're going to do that, and especially with Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon against the Broncos. Aaron Jones did practice today. He was in a limited fashion, so that is something we do have to monitor going into the weekend. And if Jones does get ruled out, that just significantly increases the value of playing A.J. Dillon this week. But when we look at this matchup, in terms of fantasy, they're giving up 32.5 points a game to running backs. Plenty to go around between Dillon and Jones. And then when we look at the last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different running backs to run over 100 rushing yards in the last 4 games. And they have allowed 10 total running back touchdowns in the last 4 games, 6 of those being rushing touchdowns and 4 of those being receiving touchdowns. So this is a scream ceiling game out of Packer players this week. So if you got Aaron Jones and he doesn't have any injury designation, definitely fire him up. But even if Jones plays, I think Dillon could be a sneaky flex play, especially considering there are 6 teams on a bye this week. My other top starts, I'm going to go with Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet against the Cardinals. Walker's definitely a for sure guy you want in your lineup. Charbonnet would be like a high risk, high reward flex play in seasonal leagues, but in terms of daily fantasy lineups, I think Charbonnet would be a great option to have in your lineup for just having a cheaper running back option for you. And then when we look at this matchup for those 2 running backs against Arizona, in terms of fantasy, Arizona's given up 23.1 points a game to running backs this year. That is the 3rd most allowed. Then when we break it down over the last 4 games, they have also allowed 3 different running backs to run over 100 rushing yards against them. And they have allowed 6 running back touchdowns over the last 4 games, 4 of those being rushing touchdowns and 2 of those being receiving touchdowns. So yeah, I definitely see this being a ceiling performance out of Walker, and then this being kind of a sneaky play, possibly in your flex, but definitely in those daily lineups for Zach Charbonnet. Moving into my top sits. My top sits of the week, I am going to go with Gus Edwards and Justice Hill against that Lions defense. That Lions defense has been phenomenal against the ground attack this season. As far as fantasy, running backs are only averaging 8.5 points per game against Detroit. That is the fewest across the NFL. And when we look at the last 4 games, the most yards a single running back has gained is 53 yards. And then in those last 4 games, they've only allowed 2 running back touchdowns, and both of those were rushing touchdowns. So they're keeping the running back total yards very low, and they're not really allowing them to get to the end zone. So basically, Edwards and Hill would be a touchdown dependent play for you if you're forced to have them in your lineups this week. My other sit, this one's going to be hard because I'm going to be honest with you, because of the bye weeks and because of this league I have them in, and I'm just dealing with injuries. It feels like everybody's dealing with injuries, and it feels like all my leagues are at this point. So I may be forced to play Raheem Mostert, and if you are going to play Raheem Mostert, I totally get it. He has like I want to say the most touchdowns among running backs this year. So maybe this is a temper your expectations play for Mostert this week, because he's probably going to finish closer to a floor game because he's going against this tough Eagles defensive front. As far as fantasy, they're only giving up 9.2 points per game to running backs. That is the 2nd fewest allowed in the NFL. And then when we look at the last 4 games, the most yards they have allowed in the last 4 games is 53 yards. I did misspeak. The Lions' most yards they allowed to a running back was 35 yards, not 53. My eyes saw it wrong. So the Lions' most running backs have gained is 35 yards, and then the most yards gained by a running back against the Eagles' defense is 53 yards. But just like the Lions' defense, they've only given up 2 touchdowns to running backs over the last 4 games, both of those being rushing touchdowns. So I do feel like Mostert is going to be a touchdown-dependent play this week, because I don't think he's going to get close to 100 yards against the Eagles' defense. Moving into the top starts and sits for the wide receiver position. These are definitely some sneaky plays because they're not really guys. They're more of like bench fillers at this point. And if you play them, if you have bye weeks, well, if you have bye weeks, I would at your wide receiver spot, I would definitely consider getting Rashee Rice or Kadarius Toney in your lineup against the Chargers. Now you could maybe sneak in an MVS or sneak in a Sky Moore maybe in your daily lineups because there'll be some cheap options for you. But let's take a look at the matchup against this Chargers defense. They're allowing 30.7 points per game to wide receivers in fantasy. That is the most allowed in the NFL. Over the last 4 games, they've allowed 2 different wide receivers to go over 100 yards, and they've allowed 4 touchdowns to wide receivers over the last 4 games. So the touchdowns hasn't really been there over the last 4 games, but this Chargers defense is struggling as a whole. And then I also factor in just the history of this Herbert and Mahomes matchup over these last few years. These matchups between the Chiefs and the Chargers, they always tended to be in shootouts. So if I can get a player in a shootout that is on the offense with Patrick Mahomes and the matchup says that previous wide receivers have had success, I'm definitely going to try to slide them into my lineups this week. My other top starts at the wide receiver position, I'm going to go with Marquise Brown and the rookie Michael Wilson for the Arizona Cardinals against the Seahawks defense. The Seahawks are giving up 29 points a game to wide receivers this year. That is the 3rd most allowed. And then when we look at the last 4 games, they've allowed at least 2 different wide receivers to go over 100 receiving yards. And they have actually allowed 7 total touchdowns to wide receivers over the last 4 games. So giving up yards, giving up touchdowns, and like I said, I think the Seahawks offense is going to kind of get back on track against Arizona. So I think Arizona is going to have to throw the ball a lot against Seattle to keep up with them and make this a contest on Sunday. Moving into my top sits at the wide receiver spot, I am going to go with Michael Pittman Jr. and Josh Downs against the Browns. I don't have to reiterate it. I'm sure you guys have heard it from other people, but the Browns statistically have one of the best defenses like in NFL history through the first 6 weeks of an NFL season. Now, when we take a look at this in terms of fantasy against the wide receiver spot, they're only giving up 10.8 points a game to wide receivers. That is the fewest across the NFL. Over the last 4 games, they only allowed 1 receiver to go over 100 yards against them, and only 1 touchdown to a wide receiver over the last 4 games. So they have been keeping the wide receivers at bay. And I saw some stat where, man, there's some crazy stats about like the amount of first downs they have given up, how often they keep teams out of the red zone, and this Browns defense is just playing out of their mind right now. And then we just saw what Gardner Minshew in this passing attack really struggled this past weekend against the Jaguars. So I know you might be forced your hand with maybe a Michael Pittman Jr., but if you can, I would definitely look to put these guys on the bench this week. My other sits, I am going to go with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams against the Ravens. Now, let me just preface this with Amon-Ra St. Brown. You're going to play him. It's just temper your expectations with him because he may have closer to a floor matchup against this Ravens defense than a ceiling matchup. Now, in terms of daily fantasy, I would definitely look to avoid St. Brown in those lineups. And then as far as Jameson Williams, I know he had that bomb touchdown, but don't forget he's not really getting the volume of targets quite yet that you want to see out of your fantasy wide receivers. But I do have my worries that some people are going to see that bomb touchdown and be like, oh, let's get Williams in my lineup this week. I would definitely wait maybe at least 1 more week before you do and start to see more targets for him too. But then also the matchup just isn't great for him, Williams or St. Brown. The Baltimore Ravens only giving up 15.9 points per game to wide receivers this year. That's the 3rd fewest across the NFL. Over the last 4 games, just like the Browns, they've only allowed 1 100-yard receiver in those games. And what's kind of funny is the Browns and the Ravens defense, both of their 100-yard receiving game they have allowed, both were to George Pickens, by the way. And then just like the Browns, they've only given up 1 touchdown to a wide receiver in the last 4 games. So these wide receivers to me are very touchdown dependent, where if they don't get you a touchdown, they're probably going to be more of their floor in terms of receiving yards this weekend. Moving into my top starts and sits for the tight end position, and there seems to be a theme, right? Play the Packers against the Broncos. I am going to go with that rookie tight end for the Green Bay Packers, Luke Musgrave, against the Broncos. Broncos have allowed 10.6 points per game to tight ends this year. That is the most allowed in the NFL. Over the last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different tight ends to finish over 65 receiving yards, and they have allowed 2 touchdowns to the tight end position. So I'm not going to sit here and rehash everything about how bad the Broncos defense is. I just think this is a great week to get those Packers in your lineup, especially with them being 6 teams on a bye. My other top start, though, I do like Pat Freiermuth against the Rams. He's making his return this week after missing the previous game because of a concussion prior to their bye week. And then he's drawing a great matchup against the Rams. The Rams are giving up 9.9 points per game to tight ends this year. That's the 3rd most allowed. They have allowed 3 different tight ends to finish over 45 receiving yards over the last 4 games. And then in the last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different tight end touchdowns as well. So tight ends are finding success against the Rams. Not many great options. I do think Freiermuth offers people a high floor for this matchup, but also could get a potential high ceiling game out of Freiermuth when they face the Rams this weekend. My top sits, another theme. I say play the Packers. I'm saying sit the Lions, which is crazy with how great the Lions have played this year. But Sam Laporta against the Ravens. Now, listen, Laporta is part of the offense. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I have Laporta in a couple of leagues. I'm still going to have Laporta in my lineup, so I'm going to go ahead and preface him with this as well. This would probably be a temper your expectation play with Laporta. He's probably going to have a floor game compared to a ceiling game, and if these guys can get to their ceiling game, that's just more of a bonus. Now, let's take a quick look. I don't have to rehash everything about how great Baltimore's defense has been playing this season, but when we take a look at fantasy, they're only giving up 2.6 points per game to tight ends this season. That's the fewest allowed in the NFL. The most yards allowed to a single tight end over the last 4 games was 46 yards, and then over the last 4 games, they have allowed 0 touchdowns to tight ends. So it's probably going to be a floor game out of Laporta. You're probably going to play him in your seasonal lineups. I get it, just temper your expectations. But as far as daily lineups, I would definitely look for another tight end option on the market. Then my other top sit, I'm going to go with Hunter Henry against the Bills. Bills are only giving up 3.3 points per game to tight ends this season. That is the 2nd fewest across the league. And then the most yards they've given up to a single tight end over the last 4 games is 43 yards. And just like that Ravens defense, they've allowed 0 tight ends to score a touchdown against them in the last 4 contests. So that would be, if you're kind of looking for a streaming option, I know Hunter Henry can be he usually gets to me like 50 yards or a touchdown. I don't think he's going to get that this week. I think you're going to see one of those floor outcomes out of him where he gets like 2 catches for 14 yards, and you're like, why did I play Hunter Henry this week? But yeah, that is my top starts and sits for week 7. As always, guys, if there's any players I did not talk about in this video and you like to get my feelings on it, feel free to shoot me a text, a DM, or slide into the comments, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. As always, hit the like button on this, hit the subscribe button or follow button, depending on what platform you're watching this on. Make sure you do follow me on all my social media platforms. As always, though, guys, you guys will see me next Tuesday night when I do my top waiver wire and streamable defenses. So I'll see you then. I hope you guys win your matchups this weekend because it's playoff push time. You got to start. It's a put up or shut up time. I was talking to a work friend about that today. So in terms of fantasy. So I'm going to hop off here, guys. Hope you guys have a great week. I'll talk to you later. Peace out.